So, welcome back everyone. We are continuing with regulatory compliance and artwork in pharma packaging, and our presenter will be Eduardo Vaquero. He is the Director of Multi-Regional Labeling Oversight for Organon. He is a healthcare professional with more than 10 years of experience in pharma industry, academia, public health, and health-related regulation. He is saying labeling core value is about to deliver the right information, clear, precise, balanced, and accessible, and packaging complying with quality, safety, and efficacy standards to ensure correct use of pharma and medical device products. So, Eduardo, please start.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I think this is very much appropriate because the previous colleague that was here explaining coming from parent company, right? So I'm coming from Organon, which was a company that spun off from MSD in 2021. And my background is medical background and public health. And today I want to talk to you about our work and regulatory topics. So let's start with this question. Why is our work important, right? And here I have selected three main aspects. The first one on the top is labeling. It's one of the top 3 causes of recalls. And this was done in a study in FDA in the US during a time period, a specific period of time where it was found out that errors in the labeling was, if not the first one, in the top 3 of reasons of recalls. The second reason is compliance with regulations worldwide, and also it's because labeling and artwork are always part of audits and inspections. So with all of this, it makes kind of obvious at this moment that artwork is important for the pharma companies. So why is artwork important? And instead of discussing this now, we are going to talk about it in the next roundtable of discussion after lunch. So now, let's move on to some concepts and topics. So what is labeling in this presentation? And I'm not saying this is the source of truth, but I just want to align on the concepts before we move on. Content is what we call labeling, and that means what the health authority has approved for the utilization of the product. And I'm sorry, I'm still trying to see how I'm going to turn my head to. The labeling is the information of the use of the product that includes safety and efficacy information. And usually these are presented in Word formats, PDFs, and it's the text, the content, put in place in local templates. And this is the ones that are used for submission and notifications to the health authority. And the labeling is associated with the marketing applications. Types of labeling. So in every country we have a very specific name for the labeling that can create a lot of confusion. You have seen this in your companies maybe, but in general we can classify in 4 major categories. One is information for the healthcare professionals or physicians, information for the patient or the users, instructions for use devices, and the text in the packaging. This is what the text we place in primary and secondary packaging. This is what in EU we call QRD, but in every other country has a different name. Then we have the artwork. So what is the artwork? Artwork is the graphical representation of the regulatory content added to these specific technical drawings with dimensions and put in place in the layout according to the company, trade dress and style, and also based on the health authority requirements. Unlike the labeling, artwork components are not really associated to the marketing applications. They are associated to SKUs and markets. The artwork is based on the local labeling content, meaning what we put here in this part, it has to be reflected in the artwork. If it's not the same exact content, errors and issues, right? And maybe you have seen those in your companies, recalls, etc. So here we define the artwork components differently. We don't talk about physician information or patient information. So here we say leaflet. Leaflet could be for physician or for the patient, but from a manufacturing perspective, maybe it's not that important to define. You have the carton, the foil, the blister, vial, syringe, etc. And here I put a little note because now with all these topics about e-labeling, Word and PDFs are not the only formats anymore for local labeling. New formats are XML, HTML, and that's supposed to be etc. But could also be a new format, right? And since I saw this group has a lot of interest in e-labeling, I just added this slide of the exercise we're doing in Organon to identify the markets where we can start having e-labeling. And we have placed different scenarios because for some countries like Japan, it's a mandatory thing, right? So either you want it or not, you have to have e-labeling. Australia as well is mandatory. We have some countries, especially in APAC, that is still voluntary. And the third column talks about the type of link between the artwork and the information. And if you saw in Google vector insert, this is very important because sometimes we talk about e-labeling, but that doesn't mean we're going to remove the paper leaflets. In some cases we will, in some cases we won't. Or it's by phase. First we start with e-labeling and maybe in a period of 1 or 2 years, we're going to start removing the paper. And the remarks in the end is the formats in which e-labeling is presented. As you can see, for example, in Japan it's XML, linking to the M.P.H text in the health authority portal. Sometimes it's just a PDF, sometimes it's HTML web page. So it depends also, this is important to have in consideration, like what kind of format we're using for e-labeling. And this is a continuation of other markets. I just wanted to bring this to you since there were many questions about it. And this is an example of the difference between labeling and artwork, at least in this presentation. As you can see in the first, I think for you is your left part, right? In your left part, it's an example of what a local labeling is. This is what you can, in some markets, submit to your agency, is the text. And to the right is the same content, the same text, but in the artwork. So this is just an example of what I just described before. So what is the overall end-to-end process when we have a technical CMC change from our perspective? And here we're going to start going into the main topic. So for this presentation, I want to create awareness of every time we receive a change from packaging sites, from packaging technology, from CMC, about changing the material, changing the, I went with Giorgio yesterday, changing the tray, right, and the dimensions, etc. Every time there's a very great, nice idea, it's important to consider the end-to-end process of the artwork so you can really make sure the project is going to meet the objectives. So here is the preliminary assessment of the project, of what is going to be the change, the project definition, then the change control, regulatory assessment, the regulatory preparation, submission and approval, artwork site pack readiness, and finally, well, the sale and importation of the product. So this is just to invite you to think in your company in which steps you are involved, right? And where should labeling and artwork be assessed firstly? Any suggestion? Where do you think should be assessed first? In the preliminary assessment. Yeah. And the question is, does that happen in your company? I hope they do. And now I want to bring you to the third step, which is change control and regulatory assessment. So I'm going to focus this presentation on the third step. Even though labeling and artwork should be assessed in the first step, for this presentation, we're going to talk about the change control and regulatory assessment. So, please raise your hand if you are involved in regulatory assessment, change control, or something similar. 2, okay. Okay, perfect. The first thing that we do in the change control and reg assessment is to define if the change impacts the Model 3 of the regulatory dossier, right? Model 3 is usually the CMC information. It can also include ancillary documents and stabilities. But two things sometimes are left out of the reg assessment: the labeling and the artwork. So the other question I want to ask you is, does your company include labeling and artwork in the change control and reg assessment? For you that raised your hand, can you say something?
Yes.
It includes both labeling and artwork? Good. Okay.
It should be.
It should be.
Some cases
It's missed, right? Yeah. Yeah, so in my case, sometimes it's missed as well. And, well, our justification is that we inherited from our parent company. So now we're trying to change what we inherited from our previous company. So what are the principles of a regulatory assessment when it comes to artwork and labeling? And here is where I like to say this is the key for compliance. When we are reviewing the content, so it could be as simple as if you're changing the distributor, the release, the manufacturing site, API, drug substance site, any part of the supply chain process, if you're changing any of that, there are markets that enlist these sites in the text, in any of the labeling components. Then you have more complex changes because sometimes, okay, we have a new primary component, primary packaging component, but what is not being told until the last minute is, oh, but the configuration we have for shared market is also changing. And if we don't know that in advance, it's going to delay your project because every time we add a market in the share pack, it's to review again the content, add the requirements of the new market into the artwork, and then go again with the other markets and say, are you okay with this change, right? So if you are changing the configuration of the countries in your share pack, it's impact to labeling. Material control strategy, right? Does this ring a bell to anyone? Please include that in your project change since the beginning. It's not the same if you're going to use the same SKU or if you're going to proliferate. Why? Because sometimes there is no impact to the labeling, but if you're changing the SKU, there's a change in the GTIM, and now there's an impact to the labeling. And well, there are other occasions where if you have embossing change, scoring, etc., sometimes images of the packaging components are described in the labeling. Now for technical artwork, so if you're changing the technical drawings, what we call the artwork profiles, so you're going to affect dimensions, codes, spacing areas, etc. Printing requirements as well, graphic changes, like the printing style for the foil. So if you're changing any of that, there is going to be potentially an impact to any market. So we created this table for our colleagues in the upstream process, for them to see If your change has anything to do with this, then you need a regulatory assessment, right? So the first part of the table is related to content change. And this one is for clinical change, which for some reason, at least in our company, it's like more difficult to create awareness that this could also impact the regulatory area as well, right? And sometimes I think for some packaging side, they say, oh no, this is just changing my profile. It doesn't need a change control, it doesn't need a regulatory assessment. Well, it may, right? So that's why we created this guidance for our colleagues in the upstream process. So the ultimate question that we need to solve in the regulatory assessment is when, where, and how do we need to submit to the health authority an error model? This is the main question. Which markets do we need to submit if you're changing the dimensions of your profiles? How? Sometimes it could be bundled with the change on itself, but sometimes there are different filings with different timelines. So that's also important to be considered for the planning of implementation. And finally, do we need our mockups? Do you obtain this outcome from a checkpoint for your change control? Yes? Okay. Which company are you from? Okay, that's very good that you receive it.
Yeah, we have similar procedure.
Great.
So, yeah. Mostly we do.
Thank you, that's great.
100%.
But is there, in your other companies, when you receive the change control, do you receive it? Okay. This is an example of what we call the our profile. Some of you may be more familiar than myself to what the clinical drawing is. Just to give you an example of this is what regulatory needs to know so we can do a proper assessment. And this is an example. This is a pack site transfer. It's just a packaging site transfer. And this is an example where there is no change in the content. So it would be very easy to think there is no regulatory impact because we're just changing the packaging site. So there is no impact to the labeling or artwork. But then we see we're changing the dimensions. Okay, that's kind of obvious. But changing the dimensions brings up a consequence of other changes, like the position of text and graphic elements, reduction of the font size, removal of the company address, removal of the spaces between the text sections, removal of the information about field size and pharmaceutical form, and removal of other graphical elements. So maybe we may have countries that the change in dimensions on itself does not trigger any regulatory submission, but maybe the reduction of the font size it may. And sometimes that reduction of the font size may even trigger readability test requirements, right? So that's why this is important to be done at least in the change control regulatory assessment phase. But it will be even greater to have it in the early first step. So the other question I wanted to ask you is, who does this assessment in your company? Regulatory, the print coordinator assigned, who does that? In which area? And there's no correct or incorrect answer, I just want to know. Huh? Regulatory? Okay.
See, in country regulatory, you often see that.
Okay. So, and I think this is one of the main problems. Usually our regulatory people, they come from health, pharma, science background. We don't have graphic design skills, right? So how are we going to do this type of assessment? So for those who respond to regulatory, do you have graphic designers to do this kind of work? Yes, that's perfect. So this is also a good idea even for topics in the future is graphic designers in the regulatory space. They are more and more needed these days. This assessment is not possible to be done without the graphic designers.
Just one comment, and probably you know that, right, because you were part of MSD, but whenever there is a change similar to the one explained here on the screen, there is a combined effort between CMC, our REC assessment team, and GTO, right, the Global Technical knowledge as to what would be the impact of the actual artwork design
Yeah.
ultimately to the patient.
Well, they do the process comparison memo, and they send the changing dimensions, but they don't do the layout.
Correct.
They don't do the layout impact assessment. So they just say you this is changing in dimensions, this is the technical part of the change, but they're not really doing this assessment of layout. So now how are you going to place things out, right? And I think we need to give more visibility to the graphic designers that are doing this either in regulatory or in the packaging sides. This is another example of what is happening where in one of our sites we're replacing blister lines for business continuity. They have been working for 35 years. And basically, what our packaging site is trying to do is to create a universal foil. So the front part is going to be pre-printed, and ideally is at the pre-printing area, it's as blank as possible so it can be used for several markets. And the back part of the foil is going to be printing line, which allows to have content specificities for each market. But again, same situation. What is the impact of the labeling? And this is just an example of how we should do the assessment on this particular change. This is how the leaflet is described. So what does it say? It says arrows are printed on the front of the pack between the tablets. Right? So if they're removing arrows, we have a problem with the labeling. What else does it say? Every time you start a new package, well, remove the trimming. Take a tablet from the top row. If there is no top row identifiable anymore in the blister, then we have an issue here, right? Also, it says take the white tablet number 1 that is in the red circle. Do we have a red circle in the new blister? So, sometimes it could be very easy from a technical perspective, oh, we're just doing this change, so regulatory should be able to just have it done by 6 months. Well, not that easy sometimes. And from the technical and design arrow perspective, there's also changes in the blister itself. Like, the dimensions are not changing for this one, but the layout is, right? So altogether, this is the both assessments that we have to get done in order for the project to move on. This is an example of a health authority request in one of our Nordic countries. So the health authority said the steer printing is no longer a good idea, especially if you have these blisters that can be caught and given individually, because then who knows if that part of the tablet or the pouch is going to have all the information. So they said, we need information in every pouch. Can someone tell me what issues you may foresee for this one? Like, what is that?
You need to have that in register, meaning you need to position that lid on the cavity exactly at the right point.
Yeah, that's for the technical perspective, so it's important. So first you have to go to the packaging side and say, my agency is requesting this, can you handle this? That's the first question. The second question is, from a regulatory point of view, any idea what would be the challenge here? Font size, a lot of text. Why? Because these are shared by many EU markets. So how, in the world, you're going to place more than 10 languages in every country? How? I mean, not possible at all. So we saw a little part in the regulation where it says, whenever it happens, you can alternate. So that means you can have 5 languages here, and a different 5 languages here, and so on.
Can I just ask where to put the lock and expiry data?
For this particular case, I don't know. But I can check and tell you later. Well, this is the end of the examples. I don't know if you have time or... I wanted to show you maybe some other examples of regulatory assessments for our